Have you ever gotten that sinking feeling when you're scrolling through job listings where everyone seems to demand more than you currently know? React, Next.js, Tailwind, animations, the list goes on, and it can feel overwhelming not knowing where to start or what skills to learn next, right? It feels like a cruel game where no matter how hard you work, the goalposts keep getting pushed further and further away. It can be enough to make you want to give up before you even get started. What if, instead of feeling like you're always just one more skill away from landing your dream job, you could build something incredible in a single video? A project so good it rivals the stunning animated landing pages for top tech companies like Linear or Chronicle. In this video, we're going to do just that. This won't be just another cookie cutter website. Together, we're going to create something that could be the difference between your portfolio blending in and standing out from the crowd. Something that makes recruiters pause, sit up, and take notice of your work. And trust me, this isn't just another basic tutorial, because in today's job market, being just another developer isn't enough. Companies are looking for people who can bring designs to life with fluid animations and pixel-perfect precision. That's exactly what we'll be doing today. We'll be using some of the most in-demand tools in modern web development, including Next.js, React, TailwindCSS, and Framer Motion. We'll harness the power of React and Next.js to build a rock-solid foundation, using components to keep our code clean and organized. We'll use Tailwind CSS to craft beautiful, responsive designs that adapt flawlessly to any screen. And then we'll bring the entire experience to life with Framer Motion, adding those subtle professional animations that make users go, wow. By the end of this video, you'll transform from someone who can code basic websites into someone who can craft engaging user experiences. Think about that next job interview. Imagine pulling out your portfolio, showing this project, and confidently explaining not just what you built, but why you built it that way. That's the kind of experience that gets you hired. This is your chance to create something that truly stands out from the crowd. So are you ready to stop watching other developers create amazing websites and start building them yourself? If so, let's dive in and create something incredible together. Before we begin, let me show you exactly what we'll be building. Starting in the hero section, you'll learn how to create stunning designs that gracefully animate onto the page. And here's a fun surprise. We've added an Easter egg where users can actually drag the designs around, creating an interactive playground that visitors won't expect, but will love discovering. Moving down, we'll build a logo ticker where company logos smoothly scroll across the screen in an infinite loop, a subtle touch that adds movement and life to the page. In the introduction section, we'll implement an impressive text effect where the words will animate in perfect sync with the user's scroll position, creating a captivating reading experience that keeps visitors engaged. The features section is where we'll really bring the magic. Every single feature comes alive with its own micro interaction. These small but impactful animations make the interface feel responsive and delightful to use. For the integration section, we'll create two independently animating columns, adding depth and visual interest to what could otherwise be a static display. When we get to the FAQs, you'll learn how to implement buttery smooth expand and collapse animations that make the interface feel polished and professional. And finally, in our call to action section, we'll create an eye-catching effect where words gracefully animate across the screen, and when users hover over them, they slow down and transform with a beautiful color transition. Before we jump in, I want to make sure you have everything you need to succeed. I've created a comprehensive starter bundle for this project, and yes, it's completely free. This bundle includes all the essentials you'll need: a pre-configured starter template, professional designs, optimized images, and every icon used in this project. This way, you can focus on learning and building without getting stuck on setup or hunting down assets. You'll find the download link for this free bundle in the description below. After you have the starter template downloaded, go ahead and drag and drop it into your IDE. That should open up the folder and allow us to get started. Once you have your template opened up in your desired IDE, then let's go ahead and install our dependencies. So what I'm going to do is go into my bottom panel and just simply run the npm install command to make sure that all of our dependencies for this project are installed. After a couple of seconds, you can see that our dependencies have been properly installed, and we now see that we have a node modules directory right here inside of our template. After our dependencies are installed, we can go ahead and run the project just by running npm run dev. This should go ahead and run the next dev command, as you can see that it's doing, and it should go ahead and give us a local URL to hit. Now I've opened up my Polypane browser to the right, so I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste that URL directly into the browser and see what it gives us here. So I can see that when my browser loads, you can see that it's showing hello world in white, and of course it has a black background on the page. Now that that's up and running, I can go ahead and hit the hide panel button to go ahead and hide my terminal for now while we get the rest of this page set up. What I'm going to do to set up my browser is I'm going to pull my window over a little bit so I can see my browser window. And by default, Polypane will give me a couple of different views. It looks like I have a 320, a 500, and the laptop view is a 1280 view, but that doesn't really match my designs. And I'd like an easy way to go ahead and set up these responsive views so that they match my designs. An easy way for me to do that is to come into my source directory, go into app, and go into my layout. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in some responsive styles. So I'm going to say that when it's small, we'll say text blue 500. It doesn't matter what color. I'm just kind of giving it some responsive styles here to make sure that Tailwind is outputting some breakpoints. I'm going to say medium text green 500, and I'm going to say large text red 500. Now, when I save that, we can see that when we go back to our browser, we now have a couple of different styles in the different breakpoints, but these aren't the breakpoints that we're using in our configuration. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and close out all of the panes from Polypane, and then I'm going to come and go ahead and refresh the page so that it can detect the responsive breakpoints that we already have in our page. Now that I've refreshed my page, you can see this button here says create 4 panes from website breakpoints. Well, that's super helpful because it can detect automatically the breakpoints that we have and then create a different pane for each of those breakpoints. You can see it's giving us a 375 breakpoint, a 768 breakpoint, and a 1200 breakpoint, which is great because that's exactly what our designs are created for. And then we also have this below 375, but I'm going to remove that because we don't need to see anything below 375. 375 pixels is the smallest design that we're going to work with. Now that those are created, I'm just going to go ahead and rename these. So I'm going to call this one mobile, and I'm going to go ahead and put in parentheses 375 pixels. The middle one I'm going to call tablet and put in parentheses 768 pixels. And then in the desktop size, I'm just going to go ahead and say desktop and put in parentheses 1200 pixels. Now that those have been automatically generated, we of course are not going to want to responsively change our text color anymore. That was just to allow us to take advantage of that great Polypane feature. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those text styles and just go back to text white, hit save, and I should see my text go back to just white across all of my screens. Now, as I'm creating this code, there's a couple other things that I'm going to want to do. One of them is to go ahead and add the reference images that we're using for the design to the side of each of my screens so that I can quickly reference that to see what we're building as we're building it. So I'm going to come up to the reference image button and click to select that reference image, and then select the proper image that I need for that particular screen. So this one is the mobile 375 pixels. So I'm going to pull that out to side by side so that I can see my code on the left and the design on the right, just to make it easier as we're building. And I'm going to do that for each of my views. So for my tablet view, I'm going to go ahead and select my tablet 768 view and go ahead and hit open, also clicking side by side so that we can see that side by side. I'm going to do the same thing on desktop. I'm going to go ahead and select an image, select the desktop 1200 pixel view, and then also push that out to side by side so we can see the desktop beside our views here. Now we've almost set everything up now, but the one thing that I don't love about this is right now our coded page isn't very tall, so we actually can't scroll and see any of this design just by scrolling on our screen. So I'd like to be able to add that affordance just by going ahead and giving some padding bottom to our page. So I'm going to come into the layout and I'm going to add a class of PB for padding bottom, and then a custom value of 10,000 pixels just to go ahead and give me some room to scroll. So if I come back over to my browser, I should be able now to scroll and then see the design on the right as we're scrolling through the page. So that'll just help me as we're coding this out. And then when we're all done, I'll go ahead and remove that padding bottom from the page as well. Now that we have everything set up to be able to code easily, I'm going to go ahead and scoot my browser window over to where I can just see the mobile view and the mobile design. And then we'll go ahead and start from there by looking at the design. Over on our design, let's go ahead and first look at the mobile view. So you can see in the mobile view in the nav bar, you have the logo along with a menu icon, and then you have a rounded border around our nav bar that's going to contain basically the blurred effect that we're going to show as we scroll down this page. Over in the tablet view, you can see that instead of showing this mobile hamburger menu icon, now we have our login and sign up buttons that we're going to be showing to the right. And then on the desktop view, you can see that we not only show our login and sign up buttons, but now we have our entire navigation as well. So that's going to include home, features, integrations, and FAQs, all sections of our page that we are going to eventually link to. Now over in our mobile view, you can see that we do have this hamburger icon, which means that we are going to create a mobile navigation, and we're probably going to go ahead and do that before we move on with any other sections of the page. Now we won't be able to link up the sections yet because we won't have all of our IDs created and they won't all be on the page, but we will be able to go ahead and just create a mobile navigation to hopefully show an X and then show our navigation here below our nav bar. Now that we know what we're going to build, let's go back into our code and go ahead and get started. To get started creating our nav bar, let's go into our source directory and then go into sections and open up our navbar.tsx file. Now we need to make sure that this is imported onto our page. This is already exported as a default function of navbar. So I'm going to come into my app directory and into my page.tsx, which represents the page that I'm currently viewing. And then we can go ahead and import that navbar from here. So I'm going to import navbar from @/section/navbar, and then we can just simply return that. Now we don't need to show hello world anymore, so I'm just going to wrap this in a React fragment and then go ahead and drop my navbar onto the page and hit save. As soon as we do that, we should see the word navbar showing up in our view, which we do, which means that our navbar is properly hooked up to our page. So with that, I can close out my page.tsx because that's all I needed that for, and come back into my navbar and start to make my edits here. We'd like for the navbar to be a section on the page, so I'm going to get rid of that div and create a section tag for that. And we'd also like it to be held within our container, so I'm going to go ahead and create a div with a class name of container to make sure that the content is pushed from the sides of the screen. After that, we can see that there's going to be a grid where we're going to have a couple of columns inside of it, both on the left and the right. So I'm going to go ahead and create a div with a class name of grid, and I'm going to make sure that we have grid calls 2 for now. And then within that grid, we'll have 2 divs that represent our 2 columns. In the first column, we know that we're going to have an image that represents our logo. So I'm going to say image, and we're actually going to pull this in from next/image, and the source of it is going to be our logo SVG. Of course, I need to import that image, so I need to come up to the top of my file and import my logo image from @/assets/images/logo.svg, and then I can then use that logo image here by typing in logo image. My alt tag is, of course, just going to be my layers logo, and then I can give that a self-closing tag and go ahead and hit save. Now in the other column, I want to drop in my menu icon, and I could drop this in basically by importing it as a logo the way that I've done with my site logo. However, this is going to be a little bit different because we're going to want to animate this hamburger menu when the menu opens up. So when we click on this, we're actually going to want to turn this into an X by actually animating a couple of these hamburger menu lines. So I'm going to do this a little bit differently. I'm going to go into my assets/images folder, find my menu SVG, and I'm actually going to directly copy and paste this into this column right here. So as soon as I do that, I'm going to go ahead and hit save. and see if there's any problems. Now you can see that this is an HTML SVG, so we just need to change class to class name, and that should ensure that it still works properly. Now that we have the content for the mobile menu on the screen, let's go ahead and do a couple of things to ensure that it's styled up the way that we see in our design. The first thing I'd like to do is come into my section and give this a little bit of top and bottom padding. So we'll say class name up here, and we'll say PY4 to give it the top and bottom that we see in our design. The other thing is for the wrapping div that's going to be containing our grid, it would be nice if we had a border around that. So I'm going to go ahead and say border and then border white/15 to give it a white border with 15% opacity. To make sure that it's rounded, we'll say rounded full to ensure that it has that border radius of the 9999 pixels that makes it look like that pill shape that we see in our design. We also want to give it a little bit of padding. So we'll say P2 to give it 8 pixels of padding on the top, bottom, left, and right. In order to align our menu navigation with our logo, we should also probably say items center here to ensure that our content is pushed towards the center. Now to make sure our logo is the right size, at this view, we'll go ahead and give our logo image a class name as well and say H9 to ensure that it is a height of 36 pixels. And then we'll also add a W auto to make sure that the width is auto so that the width aligns with the aspect ratio of that image. We're also going to scoot this over just a little bit by saying ML2 to give it 8 pixels of margin to the left, just to give it a little bit more room to breathe over there on that side. Now moving into our second column, we're going to go ahead and give this a class name of flex to go ahead and move our menu item to the right. So we'll say flex, and then we can say justify end, and that should push it to the other side of the screen. And then we can do the same thing with our SVG where we can say MR2 to give it a little bit of margin to the right. Now, instead of putting our margin left and right, it might be better for us to adjust our padding a little bit on the left and right of our nav menu. So I'm going to go ahead and take out my MR2 and my ML2 and then come up to my grid and just say, instead of P2, we'll say PX4, and that should hopefully push our menu and our logo over just a little bit like we want. Now that I think we have our navbar looking good, let me go ahead and take my reference image and just overlay it on top of my mobile view to see if there are any differences. And right offhand, I'm not seeing any differences. Let me go ahead and kind of swipe back and forth so we can see our coded page versus our design, and it looks like they're exactly the same, which is a good sign. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my reference image back out to side by side and continue on with my tablet view. Over in my tablet view, let me go ahead and scoot this out a little bit more so that we can see a little bit more of our tablet view. We can see that this is where we start to get our login and sign up buttons. So we see that, and also our logo is definitely looking a little bit bigger. It looks like it's the original size of that logo as well. So we'll make all of those changes to our tablet view as we go. In order to give our code a little bit more room to breathe, I am going to put in our left sidebar just so we can see that a little bit better as we continue to work on our navbar. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and make sure that we have our login and sign up buttons on the screen. Those are going to go in our second column. So I'm going to have this flex justify end column here where I'm going to make sure that our SVG, our hamburger menu SVG, is going to be hidden. So I'm going to say at the medium size, that is going to be hidden. And then of course, we're going to want to show the buttons that we create. Right below that SVG, I can go ahead and put our buttons in there. So I'm going to say button, our first button, and go ahead and give it the text of log in. And the second button, I'm going to give a text of sign up. After I've done that, we can go ahead and start styling these buttons up. So I'm going to give this first button here a class name, and we know that it's going to have a border, which is going to be white. So I'm going to say border white for that. We're also going to set a specific height on this. So I'm going to say H12 to give it 48 pixels of height. And we want it to be rounded full, just like this pill shape of our nav bar. So we'll say rounded full there. We could say PX6 to give it the padding 24 pixels left and right, just to give it that little bit more room to breathe. And then we'll also say font medium, just to give that medium font weight versus our normal 400 font weight. Now for our primary button, which is the button beside this is the one that has the lime background color. This is going to be a little bit different just in that it's going to have a different background color, but everything else is going to be pretty much the same. And anytime we're repeating a lot of the same code, that's a good indication that we probably need to go ahead and create a component for that code and then go ahead and use that component in our page. So I'm going to open up our sidebar and come into our pre-created components directory and go ahead and create a new file, and we'll call this button.tsx. That's going to contain our button component. Inside of our button.tsx, let's go ahead and export a default function of button, and that's going to be a React component that we're just going to return some JSX in the form of a button tag. We're also going to take some props into this component, and these props are going to be basically any HTML attribute that a button will take. So we'll say HTML attributes of HTML button element, and we'll bring in HTML attributes like it did by default from React. Let me go ahead and slide this out a little bit just so that we can see our code a little bit better. Now, what's contained inside of these HTML attributes of our HTML button element are things like the children prop and also the class name prop. So those are default props that we don't have to worry about as long as we use this type of HTML attributes of HTML button element, because it can by default take in children and class name and all of those types of props. The only different prop that we're going to take that's not a normal HTML attribute is going to be a variant prop to tell it, do we want primary, secondary, that kind of thing. So we'll say that this could be either primary or secondary. I think those are the only two variants that we'll have. And then we'll say it can also go ahead and take in all of these other HTML attributes here. So that's going to be the type that we're going to use to type our props with. After setting up our props, let's go ahead and come up to the top of our file and import CVA from class variance authority. Now, if you've never heard of CVA or you don't know about class variance authority, CVA gives us a really easy way for us to define the classes that are going to be applied to our button based on our props. So let's see how this works. We're going to say const classes, and this is going to be a function that we have, and that's going to be the result of running the CVA function and giving it some default classes, and then also giving it a configuration that tells us what other classes to apply when we have specific props selected. So one of the keys is going to be variance. And this is a little unfortunate because this might not be as understandable because we have a prop named variant, but essentially we want to put any of our props under this variance keyword as a different key. And then we'll say if that particular prop, in this case variant, is equal to primary, for example, then we give it a string of classes to add to that. And if the particular prop of variant is equal to secondary, then we can add some different classes for that. So let's go back to our button for a second in our navbar and see what classes we added to the secondary button that we already created. So I'm going to just go ahead and copy those over to our button.tsx file right now as base classes, and then we'll pull out what we don't need. So all of our buttons will have a border. It'll be a different color. So for the primary one, it'll probably be the border with a color of lime. And for our secondary, it'll be border white. So I'm going to cut this border white and drop it down into my secondary classes. They'll have the same height in this case for now. We'll say rounded full. They'll all be rounded full. They have the PX6, and of course, they'll have the font medium. So the only real differences between my secondary and my primary buttons are going to be colors. So for my primary button, we know that it's going to have a background color. So we'll say BG Lime 400 to give it the right background color. And we'll also want to say text neutral 950 to give it the right text color. And we'll also want to set the border to the right color by saying border lime 400 as well. And so for the secondary button, that's the one we've already created up here. It is going to be border white. The text is going to be white, so we can just go ahead and define that even though the default text color is white. And then of course, we're going to have a background color of transparent, which is the default, but that's fine as well. So after we have that in place, this becomes a function that we can use, and we can give it props, and it'll decide based on those props what classes it should be applying to this particular button. So let's see how we can use this inside of our component. So if we come down to button, we can say that the class name is going to be equal to this classes function. And this classes function is going to take in, of course, our variant, which is going to be equal to props.variant. And of course, it can also take in a class name, which is going to be props.className. Now, when we do that, this button should have the right classes applied to it, depending on the props that are being passed into our button component. So let me go ahead and save this file. And the only other thing we need to do is probably go ahead and pass in the rest of our props and spread them over our button. In fact, in order to not pass in class name here, we probably want to go ahead and destructure our props first. So I'm going to say const and pull out what we need. So we need variant, we need class name, and we need other props, and that's going to come from props. And that's so we don't override our class name later. And then we can just go ahead and spread out other props. And of course, we can go ahead and change this to class name here very simply. And then we can do the same thing with variant, just going ahead and giving it the same key value. And that should go ahead and pass that variant prop through there as well as our other props. So with that, let's go ahead and change this over to a self-closing component. That'll make sure that children gets properly passed in as well. And that should finish up our button for now. So now that we have created this component, let's go ahead and into our navbar and see if we can actually use this component instead of our normal button. Let me go ahead and close out my sidebar again to give my code a little bit more room to breathe. I'm going to come up to the top and I'm going to import the button component from @/component/button, and then go ahead and drop it right in here. So my button is going to be this button component, and this is what's going to say log in. Of course, the variant is going to be secondary, and the TypeScript helps me out there. And then my second button is going to be the button with a variant of primary, and that is the one that's going to say sign up. Let me go ahead and comment out my other buttons real quick, save this, and see if I see my code accurately updating over on the right. And it looks like we're getting an error because it doesn't like that our SVG doesn't have these React attributes. So I'm going to change the stroke width to that version, and of course the stroke line cap and line join to the camel case versions, and hit save again, and those errors should go away. So we can see that our buttons are showing up as they should, which means I'm going to go ahead and remove these commented out buttons right here and see what else we need to do to make sure this aligns to what we're seeing in our design. It does look like as we get to this size, the other thing I'm noticing is that in the nav bar, you have a little bit of extra space now that we're at this size. Now we probably need to take away that padding right at this size. And of course, we need to add a gap between our buttons as well. So let me go to the top of our nav bar. We can see that we have this PX4 here. So we can say at the medium size, our padding right is just going to be equal to 2 as well. And let's see after we save that if that fixes that issue. And it does look like it does. And then we're going to want to add the gap here as well for our Flexbox container. So I think we can just say gap 4, and it should spread those buttons out with a little bit of gap, which it looks like it does. And then the only other thing I want to change versus my design is the size of my logo image. Right now it's being constricted to a height of 36 pixels. We can change that at the medium size by saying medium H auto, and that should increase the size of that layers logo. Now that we've made those changes, let's go ahead and click on our reference image and overlay our design on top of our coded page and see if we have any differences. I'm not seeing any right now, which means we're good to go for now. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my reference image right back out and move on to the desktop view. Let me go ahead and slide my browser window out just a little bit so that I can get a little bit of a better view of our desktop code. So you can see that at the desktop view, we now have a center navigation that we want to be able to add that's going to have our home features, integrations, and FAQs. Everything else looks pretty much the same though, maybe except for a little bit of padding differences on the top and bottom. So let's first attack that center navigation. Back in our code, what we can see is that we of course have a grid which has 2 columns that are showing. We need to of course add a third column. So I'm going to give this a large modifier and say grid calls 3, and then we'll go ahead and add another div in between our other two to be the third column in our grid. Inside that column, we're going to want to go ahead and add in our nav links. So I'm going to create a semantic nav tag, and then inside that nav tag, I'm going to map through my nav links by saying nav links.map. And then for each one of those links, we're going to go ahead and return some JSX. That's going to be a link, and that's going to have an href of link.href and a key of link.label. Could be either href or label, but label certainly works. And then inside, we're going to say link.label, and that should ensure that our links show up there in the center. We do need to go ahead and spread those links apart. So I'm going to give the nav a class name of flex, and we'll say that we're going to have a gap of 24 pixels in between there. And we also want to bring up the font weight a little bit. We'll say font medium in order to give it that 500 font weight that we see in our design. Now that we've taken care of that, let's go ahead and see what kind of padding we need to change for our section. So right now we have PY4, so we want to change that, the large size, to double that for PY8 for 32 pixels of padding top and bottom. And let's see if that aligns with what we have in our design. And as I slide this out, the only other real difference that I'm noticing is that this navigation here on top is a little bit narrower than the navigation that we have, which is a bit wider. And that's due to this container right here. So we're going to give this a max width by saying max W5XL, and that should constrain that to a max width and push that navigation in just a little bit. The other thing we'll want to do is move our navigation towards the center of the grid container that we have it in. So on our grid, on our second grid column, we'll go ahead and say class name equals, and then we'll say flex justify center, and of course items center, just to ensure that that still works. But that should move those navigation items more towards the center of this column. After we do that, let's go ahead and take our reference image and overlay it once again to see if we are on point. And it looks like we are. I don't see anything misaligned, which is great news. So I'm going to go ahead and push my reference image back out once again. Now, that means that we are pretty much finished with the nav bar. Of course, we need to go back and ensure we didn't mess anything up with the changes that we've made. And it looks like we may have forgotten to add in a couple of classes that we need to ensure we didn't change anything down here in the tablet and the mobile view. So the first thing I'm seeing is that even though we said large grid calls 3, we do want to hide this middle grid item until we get up to the desktop view. So I need to give this a hidden class, and then I need to say at the large size, that's when we go to the flexed view. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and see if that fixes our tablet view, and it looks like it does. And then down here in the mobile view, it looks like we need to ensure that our buttons aren't showing on the mobile view, and instead we're showing the hamburger icon. So we need to fix that as well. So we need to come down into our button and make sure we give both of these a class name of hidden, and then medium inline flex will hopefully do the trick. And I'll do the same thing for the second one. Let's go class name equals hidden medium inline flex. Let's see what happens there. And now I am seeing my SVG icon instead of my buttons until I get up to my tablet view. Now, giving those inline flex classes has also made the text go towards the top. That's not something we necessarily want. So let's go ahead and ensure we also say items center to align the content towards the center by saying items center on both of those buttons. And with that, I think our mobile, tablet, and desktop views are complete. So it's time for us to move on to the next section, which is our hero. Now that we're done with our nav bar, let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to build in our hero section. So on mobile, it's really pretty simple. We have a little kind of tag looking thing up here that says 7.5 million seed round raised. And then we have our hero title, our description, and an email sign up where someone can enter their email and click the sign up button. So nothing too complicated there. When we move up to the tablet view, we don't get too much more complex than that. We just kind of spread out the text a little bit and make the title a little bit bigger. But over on the desktop view, things get a little more complicated because now we're actually bringing in these designs on the left and right side, as well as these cursors for Andrea and Brian. And in fact, we may go ahead and leave those cursors on the tablet view, just depending on what I decide when we get in there. But we definitely have a little bit more complexity there that we're going to have to deal with. This is going to be a fun section when it's all done because we're going to make sure that these are animated in and that these are draggable by the user, and also that we have a cursor that's different when the user hovers over this particular section as well. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the hero section. Coming back into our code, the first thing we needed to do is go into the source directory and go into our sections and find our hero.tsx file. Now you can see that right now it's returning a div with the text of hero, but we need to drop this into our page so that this hero text is actually showing up on the page before we can go ahead and edit this section. So I'm going to go into app/page.tsx and I'm going to import that hero section here at the top. So I'm going to import hero from @/section/hero and then just drop that hero section in below the navbar section that's already there. And if we've done that correctly, we should see the word hero showing up in our coded template, which it looks like I am. So I'm going to close out my page.tsx, come back into my hero and start creating this section code. The first thing I'm going to do is start with a semantic section tag to identify this as a section. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then inside that, we're going to have a div with a class name of container just to keep the content from hitting up against the sides of the screen. And then inside that, we're actually going to put the content of the section. So I'm going to create this div here at the top. Looks like it says 7.5 million seed round raised. And then below that, we have a semantic H1 tag that's going to say impactful design created effortlessly. And then below that, we'll have a semantic paragraph tag that's going to hold the description for the section. Now I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this, but it says design tools shouldn't slow you down. Layers combines powerful features with an intuitive interface that keeps you in your creative flow. So after I save that, it looks like it's upset that we have this apostrophe that isn't an HTML element. So I'm going to switch this to an apostrophe using our ampersand APOS semicolon, and that should keep it happy. And then below that, we simply have a form. So I'm going to add my semantic form tag. Inside that, I'm going to add an input of type equals email. This is also going to have, as I scroll down, it looks like it has a placeholder of enter your email. And then below that, we have a button with a type of submit that's going to have the text of sign up. Now we have created a button component already. We know that it's going to change a little bit from the button that we created before because this one looks a little bit smaller, so we can go ahead and add a size prop when we get down there. But for now, we're just going to keep it as this semantic button until we get to that styling portion of this section. Now that we have all of the content on this page for this section, let's go ahead and start creating some of the styles, starting with our section itself. So we're going to go ahead and add a class name here, and we're going to add some padding to set it apart from the navbar. So we're going to say PY24. That'll add 96 pixels of padding to the top and bottom of this section. And then inside there, we're going to go ahead and create the styles for this tag above our H1. So we're going to add a class name here. And those styles are going to be inline flex to ensure that it doesn't take up the full width of the screen. We're going to say PY1 to give it 4 pixels of padding top and bottom, PX3 to give it 12 pixels of padding left and right. And then we're going to go ahead and set a background gradient with BG gradient to R for to right. And then we're going to say from purple 400 to pink 400. And that should create our gradient the way that we see it in the design. After that, there's still a couple more things we need to do. We need to go ahead and give it some border radius. So I'm going to say rounded full. We also need to set the text color. So text neutral 950 is what we'll select. And then we also want to make the font a little bolder. So I'm going to say font semi-bold, and that should create a little bit of bolder font. Now, there's still a couple of things we need to do. First of all, we need to go ahead and put our emoji in here. So on the Mac, I'm going to hit Control, Command, Space. That's going to allow me to use my emoji picker to select my sparkle emoji. And I'm just going to go ahead and put a space in between there. Save that again, and that should be the emoji that we need. Around this div, we also need to center this. So I'm going to go ahead and put a flexed container. In order to center this div, we do need to go ahead and place another div around it. And we'll go ahead and give this a class name of flex and say justify center. That should allow this seed round raised div to go ahead and be centered on the page. After that, let's go ahead and take care of our H1 style. So I'm going to give this a class name as well. And we're going to start with text 6XL to set the font size. We're also going to say font medium and text center to center the text on the page. And then we'll say MT6, and that should give us the 24 pixels of margin on the top. That will push our H1 down from our seed round tag. Coming down to our paragraph, we need to go ahead and give this a class name as well. And we'll say the text should also be centered. So I'm going to say text center. We're going to give it a font size with text XL. And then we'll set the font color with text white /50 to give it 50% opacity. And then MT8 should give it 32 pixels of top margin. That should push it down from our H1 on our page. Our form is going to be a little bit trickier, but let's go ahead and see how we're going to do this. Let's give this a class name as well and say that it's going to be flexed for sure. We're going to have a border on that, and that border is going to be white /15. We're going to make sure that it is rounded full to have the border radius that we want. We're also going to say that we're going to give it 8 pixels of padding, similar to the nav bar up there. So we're going to say P2 to give that 8 pixels of padding. MT8 should give it the right amount of margin. And then the rest of our content should be styled inside of this in order to get this to look correct. For the input, let's go ahead and give this a class name as well. And we want to make sure that the background is transparent. So we'll say BG transparent, and then PX4 should ensure that we have the right amount of padding on the left and right of our input. And now we need to go ahead and make sure that we have our button component imported in order to use it for this button down here. So I'm going to come to the top of my file. I'm going to import button from @/component/button, and that ensures I can just use this right here. So I'm going to go ahead and replace our button JSX tag with our button component. The type should be fine, but it doesn't have a variant yet. So let me go ahead and give it a variant of primary, which should go ahead and set the background color of that button. And let's come back to our component to make sure our TypeScript type is correct, because a button should be able to take a prop of type. So I'm going to come back into my button component and see if maybe we need to use a different HTML button attributes. As I look at my TypeScript type, it looks like we need to do button HTML attributes instead of HTML attributes, and that should give us the type equals submit prop that can be passed in. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and come back to my hero.tsx, and now it looks like our TypeScript type is correct. The other thing we need to ensure with our button is that our text is not wrapping. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a class name, and we're going to say white space no wrap, and that should ensure that we're not having any wrapping on our button. But as you can see, the button is still a little bit bigger than the one that we're seeing in our design. So we need to have a small variant as well. So let me go ahead and come into my button and see how we can accept a prop for a size as well. So we have this props object. Let's go ahead and add a size prop. And let's say it can be optional, but if it's there, it can only be small. That means that the default one won't be able to be passed in, but the small one will. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then up in my variants, I can say that we have a size prop that's going to have an option of small. And if that option is selected, then we're going to add on H10 that will make it 40 pixels tall instead of our 48 pixels. So now that that's added in there, let's make sure that TypeScript is happy. It doesn't like that this isn't used. So I'm going to go ahead and take that off and save that one more time and come back into my hero.tsx and make sure that we're including size equals small on this button. And let's see if that makes our button any smaller. And I'm seeing that it's not making it smaller, which means we need to do one more thing back in our button, and that is to ensure that the size prop is being passed in. So I'm going to say size for my props, just going to destructure that, add that into the classes under variant. So I'm going to say size there, and that should ensure that my size prop is being passed to my classes function, just to ensure that it's getting everything that it needs in order to style this correctly. After I'm done with that, I'm going to go ahead and close up my button.tsx because I think we're done with that for now. And then we just simply need to look at our reference image versus our coded template. So I'm going to go and come up to my reference image and say overlaid, and then see if there's any differences in this section. And right now I'm not seeing any, which means I think for the mobile view that our hero section is complete. So I'm going to pull that back out to side by side and go into our tablet view. Now, as I come over into my tablet view, I need to go ahead and pull my browser out a little bit to get a better view of this section. Of course, I'm going to put in the sidebar to give our code a little bit more room to breathe, but there's certainly going to be some things that we're going to need to change in our tablet view. Certainly the first thing I'm seeing as we move up to the medium size is that our text size for our title is definitely changing. So I'm going to change that at the medium size to text 7XL. That should ensure that we have the right font size for that particular section. It also looks like there's just a little bit of a max width put on this design tool's description down here, because we're seeing that it cuts after powerful, but in this one the line break is after features, so we need to go ahead and put a max width on this. It looks like that is a value of max width 2XL, and that just pulls that in just a little bit so that the line break happens at the right size. And then of course down in our form we have an even smaller max width, so I'm going to add a max width to this form. We're just going to say at the medium size we have a max width of large, and in fact we don't even need that at the medium size because it's not going to grow that big at the small size. So I'm just going to save that directly as a max width large. After we've done that, we also need to ensure that our sign up button is showing up on the right side of the form rather than in the center, and that basically means that we need to tell our input to grow to take up any available space before we have our button placed. So let's go ahead and give this a class name of, at the medium size, let's say flex1. That should ensure that that input will grow to take up all the available space. And then this form also needs to be centered on our screen. Since it is flex, I think we can just say MX auto, and that should push it towards the center of the screen and ensure that it matches what we see in our design. Now that we have all that in place, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image and see if there's anything different from our reference image to our design. The only thing I'm seeing right now is this description, and I think that's because even though we gave it a max width, we didn't ensure that it's sitting in the middle of the screen, and we do that with MX auto. So we put the margin left and right auto on there, and that does look like it matches our design. So with that, let me go ahead and pull back out my reference image to side by side. Now our tablet view is done, and now we just need to move on to the hero section for the desktop view. Let me go ahead and pull out my browser a little bit so that we can take a better look at this design versus what we have right now in our hero section. So of course we already have our title, this tag up top, the description, and the form, but it looks like we're adding a couple more things in this desktop design. One of those things is these two cursors. So you can see I have an Andrea cursor, I have a Brian cursor. So these cursors are definitely going to be something that we're going to want to absolutely position based on the position of our content. The other thing we're going to want to position is these two designs that are now showing up on the left and the right, that we're definitely going to want to put those into place as well. And the only other difference that I'm really seeing with this design is that we are now seeing that our title has gotten even bigger in this desktop design. So let's go ahead and take care of the title first, and then we'll come back and make sure we have our cursors in place, and then we can come back and make sure that we have our designs aligned on the left and the right side. So coming back into my code, let me go ahead and pull that window out a little bit. Let's go ahead and try and make it about half and half, and then we'll go ahead and take our H1 and say at the large size, this is going to be text 8XL. That'll make it that 96 pixels. That should match our design pretty closely. Before we go any further, let me go ahead and overlay my reference image one more time to make sure that we don't have any content changes. And it doesn't look like we do. It looks like everything else is fine. So I'm going to pull that back out to side by side and go ahead and import our cursors into this section. So coming up top into my component, let me go ahead and import the design example 1 image from @/assets/images/design example 1. We're also going to import the design example 2 image from @/assets/images/design example 2. And let's go ahead and get those in place, and then we'll worry about the cursors next. So let me go ahead and come into my container and go ahead and put in a couple of absolutely positioned divs. So the first one is going to be this design example 1. So I'm going to create a div, and then inside that div, I'm going to add a Next.js image from next/image. The source of that is going to be my design example 1 image. The alt tag is going to be design example 1 image. And with that, it should show up on our page. Let me go back to our coded page and see if that's there. And it does look like it's there. Of course, we need to make this absolute positioned. So I'm going to say class name equals absolute. And to position it inside of my container, of course, I'm going to want to make my container relative. So we'll say relative for that container just to ensure that we're positioning it inside the right thing. We're going to go negative on the left direction. So we'll say negative left 32 to get it out towards the left. We'll push it down a little bit with top 16. And then we'll just ensure that it's in the right place by going ahead and overlaying our reference image one more time and seeing if it matches exactly, which it looks like it does. So I'm going to pull this back out one more time and go ahead and attack the other image on the other side of the screen. That's going to be this add profile image over here. So in order to position that, let's go ahead and add another absolute position div. So I'm going to say div class name equals absolute. We know this is going to be absolutely positioned. And inside of that is going to be another next image. So image source equals design example to image. The alt tag is going to be design example to image. And I'm just going to go ahead and self-close that div and go ahead and save that. Now that we have that on the screen, it's time to position it into the right position. So I'm going to give this a negative right value of 64. That's going to be negative 256 pixels from the right. We're going to bring this up with negative top 16 to bring it up negative 64 pixels. And that looks like it's in the right position, but of course we can just go ahead and verify that by pulling our reference image over top of our design and going ahead and scrolling a little bit just to make sure that those are aligned. Now what I'm seeing here is that if I side scroll to the left and the right, we're actually able to move our coded template over a little bit, and that's not what we want. So how we get rid of that is to ensure that any of the overflow gets clipped off of the section so we can't do any side scrolling. So I'm going to say overflow x clip, and that should ensure that we don't have that overflow showing. So as I scroll side to side, now I'm not seeing that anymore, and my design is matching up exactly with what I'm seeing in my code. Now that we've put those in place, I'm going to move my reference image back out to side by side and then deal with these pointers that we know that we're going to have to create as well. So we can see that we have this mouse pointer and it says Andrea here. We're actually going to create this as a pointer component where we're going to be able to pass in a name to this pointer. In order to do that, let's go ahead and open up our sidebar and go into our components and create a new file called pointer.tsx, and that will allow us to create this pointer component. We're going to export a default function of pointer out of here, and it's going to take in, of course, some props and return some JSX. So inside our pointer, we're going to have a div. That div is going to contain the SVG for the pointer as well as the pointer label. So for that SVG for our pointer, that's going to be inside assets/images/mouse pointer. So I can just go ahead and copy and paste this directly into my pointer.tsx. Let me go ahead and hit save on that and see if that gives us any problems. Of course, that is HTML. We need to convert that to JSX by doing a couple of things, that being one of them. The other, making sure we have the right attributes on our SVG. As soon as we do that, we have the ability then to go ahead and add a class name on here if we want to, and to go ahead and change this SVG however we want. So that works really well for us. And then we want to go ahead and add our label. So that's going to be inside of another div, and then we're going to have a div that contains our label. So right now we know that there's going to be a name in here. For now, I'm just going to say Andrea because we know that's one of the names that we are going to use for this. And then we'll just go ahead and make sure that the icon is white by just saying text white. Now, why we can do that is because the stroke says current color. So whatever our text color is, that's going to be the color of our SVG. So after I've done that, let me go ahead and save that, and let's just start using our pointer for now. We're actually going to take away these props for now just so it's happy, and then we're going to come back into our hero.tsx and just go ahead and import that pointer and see what happens. So I'm going to come up to the top of my file, say import pointer from @/component/pointer, and then I'm just going to drop that into an absolute div. So I'm going to say div class name equals absolute, and then inside that we'll have our pointer component. And as soon as we do that, we do see that we now have that pointer showing up. there's a couple of changes we need to make versus our design in order to get this to work well. One of them is we're going to need to bring down the size of this a little bit. So it's by default, it's 24 by 24 pixels. We need to say that that's going to be 20 by 20 by saying size 5, just to make that a little bit smaller. The other thing is, of course, we need to change the styles of our names. We're going to say div class name here. I say inline flex, rounded full. We also need the font to be bold. The text is going to be small, and the background color is for Andrea. Let's see, that one was going to be our blue. So for that one, we can say BG blue 500 for now. Of course, we're going to change that here in a second. And we'll also need a little bit of padding left and right. We're going to say PX2 to add in that padding. And we know from our design that only one side is not fully rounded. So we can see in our design that we have this square edge on this top left corner. So we need to say rounded TL for top left, none. That should ensure that for our component, we have the same thing going on. Now let me go ahead and word wrap this because it's really hard to see. Let me go ahead and toggle word wrap so we can see this a little bit better. But we have this outer div, we have an SVG, and then we have this inner div. We need to position this so that it ends up at the bottom right-hand side of our cursor. And the way that we can do that is we can go ahead and say div class name equals relative on the outer one. And then on this wrapper around our label, we can say div class name equals absolute, and then position that label where we want it to go. So that's going to be top full, left full, and that should ensure that we have it over there to the bottom right. After we've done all that, we know that we are going to want to change this component a little bit by taking in some props. So we're going to go ahead and add in our props, which is going to have a type that's going to allow us to take in a name prop, which is going to be a string, as well as a color prop, which is going to be optional, but it's either going to be red or blue. After we save that, we can go ahead and destructure those props out. So I'm going to say const name and color. We're going to destructure those from props, and then we'll just go ahead and insert the name inside of our label. So we're going to say name here. We're just going to replace that. And then for our color, we're going to use Tailwind merge to be able to dynamically change the color of our label. So to do that, we need to come to the top of our file, go ahead and come to the very top and say import TW merge from Tailwind merge. And then we can use that down here for our class name. So we'll say TW merge, and then we're just going to wrap that in that function. And we'll say if color is equal to red, then we want to add in BG red 500 instead. So essentially the blue isn't doing anything right now. It's basically just sitting there. And then if someone changes the color to red, then this is going to replace the BG red 500 is going to replace our BG blue 500. Now you might wonder why I want Tailwind merge in here. And this is a very good example of why we would want this in here. Tailwind merge is good at basically taking the last conflicting class that you have. So if you have two classes that basically do the same thing, it's going to take the last one that you've added and it's going to override this other one right here so that the class name that it actually outputs in the code is just going to be the BG red 500. We're not even going to include the BG blue 500, and Tailwind merge does that automatically for us. It's a great Tailwind utility for us to be able to use inside of our pointer component. So with that, let's go ahead and close out our pointer because I think we're done with these styles for this for now. And we also need to come in here and say name equals Andrea, and that should ensure that we have the name Andrea showing up on our pointer now. Now that we have that pointer showing up correctly, let's go ahead and position it correctly as well. So we know that it's going to be a little bit from the left. So we're going to say left 56 to position it from the left, and then the top value is going to be 96 to get it in position from the top as well. And that looks correct, but of course we can verify that by pulling our reference image over and just overlaying it and seeing if that pointer is in the right spot. And it looks like it is. So let's go ahead and do our other pointer as well. So below the Andrea pointer, we're going to go ahead and have a div. The class name is going to be absolute. We know that for sure. And we're going to have another pointer component. This pointer component is going to take the name of Brian, and it's also going to have the color of red in this case. And so if I save that, we should see the Brian pointer show up And then we just need to position it in place as well. So let's go ahead and give this a value of right 80 to position it 320 pixels from the right. And then we're going to say negative top 4 just to position it up just a little bit from where it was. And once again, we'll just double check this by going ahead and pulling our browser out, taking a reference image, overlaying it on top, and seeing if everything looks like it's in the right position. So it looks like everything is in the right position, which means that this desktop responsive view is also done. And this section for now, at least from a static perspective, is complete. Since that's in the right position, this means this section is almost complete. The only other thing we need to do is go back and check and make sure we didn't break any of our other designs that we have based on what we've added in our desktop view. So it looks like all of those things we added in our desktop view are showing up in our tablet and our mobile view, which is definitely crowding the screen and definitely making this something we don't want to see. So let's go ahead and see how we can fix that problem. And all we really want to do is ensure that our absolutely positioned divs with our images and our pointers aren't showing up until we get to the desktop view. So that just means we need to add some classes on those. So we're going to say hidden to make sure that they're hidden by default. And then we're going to say large block, and that should ensure that it doesn't show up until the desktop view. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste that over to my second absolute position div, my third absolute position div, and my fourth absolute position div. Go ahead and save that one more time, pull out my browser so I can see if there's anything else that I've inadvertently done to impact my mobile views, but it doesn't look like it. It looks like we're good all the way down now. So that means this section is complete now, which means we can move on to our next section. Coming back to our design, let's take a look at the next section in our mobile view. So we can see that as we move down, we have this logo ticker section where we're going to have the logos coming in from the right side of the screen and moving to the left, and of course, fading in and out as they come in and of course out as they go out. Now you can only see a couple of these logos at the mobile view, but as we go into the tablet view, of course, you can see at least another logo. And in the desktop view, you're going to get the widest view where you're going to be able to see the most logos as they fade in and out. Now there's not going to be too much to this section from a static perspective. So now, of course, right now we're just going to build this statically, and then we'll get to the animation part of this section later. But this section is going to be a lot of fun and not too difficult to build. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the code. In order to start creating this section, I'm just going to go ahead and scroll down and take a look at what it looks like in the design. And then I'm going to come into my source sections and find my logoticker.tsx and take a look at what the starter code for this section looks like. So we have our default function that's exported. That's this component called logo ticker, and it's just returning the words logo ticker inside of a div. We also have all of our logos that are pre-imported for us. So we have this array of logos with a name and an image, and that image is already coming from our assets/images and importing an SVG for each of these. So this should be pretty easy to use when we get there. Now, in order to get the logo ticker on the page, though, we need to go into our page and go ahead and import this component. So I'm going to go inside of my app/page.tsx and import my logo ticker component from @section/logo ticker and just drop it below my hero section. So I'm going to say logo ticker right here, and that should put it onto the page. If I've done this correctly, I should see the words logo ticker here on the right, which I do, which means that looks like it's linked up correctly. I'm going to close out my page.tsx and come back into my logo ticker. Now, the first thing I want to do is just go ahead and put the JSX content onto the page. So I'm going to create a semantic section tag. Inside that section, we're going to have a div with a class name of container to hold our content of our section. Inside that, we're going to have an H3, a semantic H3 for the already chosen by these market leaders title for this section. And then inside of that, we're going to have a couple of divs that are going to wrap our images. So I'm going to say logos.map. And then I'm going to say for each logo, we're going to be showing a next image. So I'm going to import my image from next image, go ahead and give it a source of logo.image. The key for these is going to be my logo.name. So that's a string key. And then my alt tag is going to be some variation of my logo name. So we're just going to say for now, logo.name, and that should take care of that. After I say that, I should see all of my logos displayed on the screen, which I do. And now that we have our content in this section, that means we're ready to start creating the styles for this section as well. So I'm going to come up to my section and say class name equals PY24 to give it the top and bottom padding. And since we know that these logos are going to flow off the left and right of the screen, we don't want that to be able to be scrollable. So we're going to say overflow X clip, and that should ensure that the overflow in the future is not going to be scrollable. Coming into our title styles, we can say class name on this as well, and we'll say text center to get it towards the center of the screen. Text white 50 should ensure that it's white with 50% opacity, and then text XL will make it the right font size. For our logos, we'll want to go ahead and make sure that those are flexed. This is going to be the div that's surrounding our logos immediately. So we're going to go ahead and give that a class name of flex gap 24 to give it 96 pixels of gap in between these logos. And then we're also going to add a little bit of padding to the end of this. That's just for preparing for the future when we need to use that padding to ensure that we have a smooth animation. So I'm going to go ahead and put the padding there just at the end to make sure that we have equal spacing if we duplicate these logos, which of course we will in the future for our animation. Now for the div that is surrounding this flexed div right here, now for the div that is surrounding our flexed div with our logos, we need to go ahead and make sure that it is hiding our overflow. So I'm going to say div class name equals, and we'll say overflow hidden to ensure that none of the overflow is showing. And then we can say MT12 to make sure it has the right margin. And then we'll go ahead and give it a mask to ensure that these logos look like they're flowing in and off the screen and just transitioning. So we'll say mask image, and this is going to be a linear gradient that's going to go to the right, and it's going to go from transparent to black at 10%, back to black at 90%, or ending the black at 90%, and then going back to transparent at the end. If we've done that correctly, we should see a little bit of a fade to black effect on the left and a fade to black effect on the right. Since I see both of those, it looks like that rule is correct. Now that that's complete, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image and see if we have this lined up. And you can see that it's perfect down here. It's actually almost perfect up here. It looks like we have a little bit of a problem with our form. So let's go back real quick into our hero and see if we can just correct that by just updating our styles. So it looks like what's actually going on is because this form is flexed, it's actually respecting this like minimum size of this input. We need to make sure that it just says width full to make sure that it just takes up the size that it can take up and no more. And it looks like that fixes that form issue as well. So that takes care of that. So I'll go ahead and close out the hero, come back to my logo ticker, and just once again ensure that this looks good. Definitely looks good on mobile. So that means we can go on to our bigger sizes. As I scroll over to the tablet view, let's go ahead and take a look. It looks like it's right on point already. It looks like there's no changes needed. So I'm going to go ahead and overlay my reference image on top of this one as well. I'm not seeing any differences there, so I'm going to pull it back out. That means our tablet view is done. Let's go over to our desktop view. And once again, I'm going to put down my sidebar and pull my browser window out a little bit more so we can take a better look. And everything looks like there's no changes needed, but of course we can verify that by pulling our reference image over top and overlaying it and seeing if there are any changes needed. And I'm not seeing anything, which means that for now, this section is complete. Coming back into our design, let's talk about what we're going to do in the next section. So the next section is this introduction where we have this first sentence here that's going to be highlighted in white. And then you have this next sentence here that is going to be highlighted as the user scrolls. And then finally coming down to the sentence that's highlighted in this lime color. Now we're not going to do any of the animation, scroll animation right now. We're going to come back to that at a future time. So this is actually going to be pretty easy because we're going to put this tag right here. We're going to certainly make sure that all of our text is the right color, but it's just going to be whatever fits inside that container and just making sure it's the right size. Over in our tablet view, it's going to be very similar. We're going to have a little bit bigger text, but that's going to be pretty much the only difference here. And then on our desktop view, the same thing is going to be true. We're going to have bigger text, but everything else should be colored like it is in the smaller responsive views. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into our code and see what we need to do for this section. To get started with this section, let's go ahead and go into our source directory and go into sections and find our introduction section. Now you can see that this one is a little bit interesting because it's actually breaking out the text of this section that's going to be in the middle, this kind of scrollable text, as its own variable. So we'll see how to put that in there. But for right now, we just know that we have this exported default function of introduction, which is just our component that we need to drop into our page. So to hook it up with our page, let's go into our app/page.tsx and import introduction from @/sections/introduction, and then drop it into the bottom of our page by just dropping in the introduction component and hitting save. If we've done this correctly, we should see the word introduction over here on the right in our browser. So we can close out our page.tsx, come into our introduction section, and get started creating this section. Now, the first thing we're going to do is put in our content. So we're going to replace our div with a semantic section tag. Inside of that section, we're going to have a div with a class name of container. And then inside the container, we are going to have a tag right now that's going to be represented by a div that's going to say introducing layers. And then below that div, we're going to have another div, which is the text of this section. This is going to say your creative process deserves better. And that is going to be inside of a span tag so that we can go ahead and make sure that we can style it correctly. And then in the next span tag, we're going to have the actual text that we have up here, this right here. So we're going to go ahead and just drop that text directly into the page. And then below that, we're going to have a span tag that represents the third section of text that's going to say that's why we built layers. And like our other apostrophe, we need to go ahead and replace that with the HTML entity. So we can say ampersand APOS semicolon, and that should replace that apostrophe and keep TypeScript happy with our component. Now that that's all done, let's go ahead and start to add some styles to our section. So the first one on the section tag, we're going to add a class name, and we're going to add the padding that we normally do. So we're going to say PY24, or excuse me, PY-24, and that should add the padding that we need top and bottom. Below that, for our tag, we can see that we have this introducing layers here. Now, the thing about this tag is that we do use it multiple times throughout the page. Because you can see even in the next section, we have a features tag. So we probably want to break this tag out into a component. So I'm actually going to come inside of my components, go ahead and add a new file called tag.tsx. And here's where we're going to have our tag created. So we're going to export default function tag, and we're going to return some JSX. That's just going to be a div that's going to have inside of it a span tag for our star that you see, and then a span tag for the text of the tag. Now we're going to take in some props, and those props are just going to be HTML attributes of a div. So HTML attributes of HTML div element. And that should allow us to pass through things like class name and children, which we want to be able to do. For our class name here, we're going to go ahead and say class name equals, and then we'll go ahead and add our TW merge function to allow someone to pass in a class name if they'd like to, but we're going to have some default class names there. And of course we need to import this. So let me go ahead and come back here, hit enter, and that should import TW merge automatically from Tailwind merge. And then let's go ahead and destructure our props. So I'm going to say const class name. We'll also know that we're going to grab children for the text, and then we're going to have anything else that someone might pass in, although that's going to be rare or probably won't happen this time. We'll go ahead and spread out other props anyway. So other props, always a good idea to do that with any component. For the class name, we can go ahead and say if someone adds a class name to our component, we'll just go ahead and merge it onto the list of our class names that we have right here. And of course, we're going to drop children into the second span tag here. Now, in the first span tag, we need to create our star. Now, we don't have an SVG for this. This is actually an HTML character, and we can create this entity by basically giving it the ampersand, then the hash symbol, and saying 10038 semicolon. This is actually a character that is creating our star for this tag. Now, in order to kind of be able to see these changes as we make them, now that we have the basics of this tag component in place, I'm going to go ahead and pull this into my introduction. So I'm going to come to the top above my text and say import tag from @/component/tag, and then replace this div right here with my tag. So I'm going to say tag here, and we know that the text is going to be introducing layers. After we've done that, we can see that we have the star there. Of course, we don't have the styles that we need yet. So let's come back into our tag and add the default styles. The first thing we're going to do is go ahead and add an inline flex here. We also know that we're going to have a border. So I'm going to say border, and then the color is going to be lime 400. So border lime 400. We want to put a gap in between the star and the text. So in this case, I'm going to say gap 2 to put 8 pixels of space in between there. We also want the text of this to be lime 400. So I'm going to say text lime 400. We're going to have some padding left and right. So px3 is going to put 12 pixels of padding left and right. py1 will put 4 pixels of padding top and bottom. And rounded full should make sure that we have the right border radius on this tag. The only other thing I see is we need to make sure that everything is uppercase. So I'm going to say uppercase to ensure that we have the right text transform added onto this. And we actually want a little bit of size difference between our star and our actual text here. So I'm going to come into this span tag here and say class name equals text small. That should ensure that we have the right font size for our text. And then we just need to make sure that it's aligned into the center by saying items center, and that should align items towards the center. After we've done that, I think our tag component is ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my introduction and go ahead and wrap my tag component that I've already created in a div so that I can center it on the page. So I'm going to just wrap this in a div, say class name equals flex, justify center, and that should ensure that my tag is pushed towards the center of this page. Moving on below our tag, let's go ahead and add the styles for our text. So we need to make sure that this is all the same font size. So we're going to say class name here, and we'll say text 4XL. That should make it the correct font size. We of course want it to be text center, and font medium should handle the font weight. To push this down from our tag, we'll go ahead and give this text a class of MT10. That should ensure that we have that margin top there. And then we're going to want to change some of the styles around this text. So for this middle span, we're going to say class name equals, and go ahead and give it a class of text white /15 to make it a lot darker. And then for this third span here, we're going to say class name equals and say text lime 400. That should make that the right color. Now you can see that in our third line, we actually have this breaking out into a new line. So we can just go ahead and add the block class here, and that should hopefully make sure that it breaks out into a new line. The only other thing that I'm seeing that's a bit different between our design and our code is that there's no space in between this period and this Y. So we need to make sure that there's a space added there. And an easy way to do that inside of React is just basically to add a space inside of brackets. That should make sure that there is space in between those lines. After that, it's time to see how close we came to our design. So I'm going to take my reference image, go ahead and overlay it on top of my coded section and see if there are differences. And it looks like the difference in this section is around this padding top here. So instead of PY24 in this particular case, we're going to say PY28 just to push it down a bit more. And as you can see, as soon as I do that and go ahead and scroll up and down, now things match up perfectly. And the reason we did this is actually because we're going to want some additional padding when we actually scroll up to this section, when we have this scroll animation working. And so that extra bit of padding is going to make sure that our nav bar is not covering up this text as we're trying to read it. Now that we have that done, let's go ahead and pull our reference image out back to side by side and come over to our tablet view and see what's different here. I'm going to push my sidebar in, go ahead and pull my browser window out a bit, and you can definitely see that even though the tag is the right size and it looks like we even have the right amount of padding, we definitely don't have the right font size for this particular size. So I'm going to come down to where we have text 4XL. I'm going to say at the medium size, we need that to be text 6XL. That will ensure that we have the right font size there. After we've done that, let's go ahead and pull our reference image overlaid on top of our coded page and see if there's anything that is different. It doesn't look like it, which means I can push that out back to side by side. That was the only difference in our tablet view. Let's go to our desktop view and see how things look over there. So this definitely needs a bump in text size as well. So we'll go and add in a large text 7XL rule to bump up that font size. And then we'll see if it's equivalent to what we have in our design as well. So it does look like there's a little bit of extra padding up here that we don't have yet as well. So at the large size, we're going to add the PY40 rule. That should add some extra padding in there and ensure that we have things matched up to our design. And once again, the reason that we're messing with this padding is actually it's going to come later when we do our animation for this section. But for right now, we're just going to go ahead and add the extra padding that we need. So when I overlay my design, you can see that as soon as I scroll up and down, things are matching up perfectly, which means that as long as we didn't break anything coming down here, which I don't think that we did, everything is coded up correctly. So I'm going to pull back out my reference image, and that means we can move on to the next section of the page. Now that we've created our introduction section, it's time to move on to our features. Now this is going to be one of the more complex sections of this page, but it won't be really too bad once we dive into it. So we're going to have this real-time collaboration feature, this interactive prototyping, keyboard quick actions, and of course, we're going to have a bunch of other features that are listed out below this. Of course, when we come back and we do this section complete with animations, all of these are going to have animations that happen on hover that are going to add some engaging effects to this section. Coming over into our tablet view, we can see that now we're lining this up where we have kind of a left, right, center feature for all three features. And then we have our other features listed out below that. And then on the desktop view, we're going to have a 3-up grid that's going to show our features with the other features listed out below. So nothing too crazy here, but we're going to have some challenges with this section. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the code. Coming back into our code, let's go ahead and scroll down to our features design and then go into our source directory under our sections and open up our features.tsx. Now you can see that we have a small array of features. These are actually the ones that are listed out under here. But for all of our other ones, we're going to code them as kind of ad hoc features. And we also have our features component that right now is just returning the word features. So let's come into our app directory and then go into our page.tsx and import our features component or our features section from @section/features, and then go ahead and drop it onto the bottom of our page by going ahead and adding that component there. If you've done that correctly, you should see the word features showing up in your page. So let's go ahead and close that page out, come back to our features section and get started coding up the content of this page. What I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the div with a semantic section tag. Inside of our section, we're going to have a div with a class name of container. And inside that container, we are going to use our tag that we've already created, our component tag, and say features here. Below the features tag, we're going to have an H2 that's going to say where power meets simplicity. And I'm going to wrap my simplicity in a span because we know we are going to add some different styles to that particular word. Under that, we have our 3 features. So I need to throw that in a div. I'm going to have a div, and then each of these features is going to be within another div. So div here, I'm just going to copy and paste this 3 times to make sure I have each of my feature cards. The first one is going to say real-time collaboration. So there's going to be some sort of image up here, and then we're going to have our content for this, and then we're going to have probably an H3 that says real-time collaboration. And below that, we're going to have a paragraph that says work together seamlessly with conflict-free team editing. That's going to be the first one. Now for the second feature, I can pretty much just kind of copy and paste what I have right here. So I'm going to copy and paste this down to my second feature and then just change the text. So the text of my second feature is going to say interactive prototyping as a title. So I'm going to say interactive prototyping. And then the text is going to be engage your clients with prototypes that react to user actions. And then my third one is going to be, once again, kind of a copy and paste here of my feature cards. I'm going to save that, come down here and say keyboard quick actions. And the text for this is going to be powerful commands to help you create designs more quickly. After I've done that, below my feature cards, which is in this div, so I'm just going to go ahead and fold this div up so I can easily see what's after that. I'm going to have another div, and that div is going to map over these other features that I have. So I'm going to go ahead and take my features. I'm going to say dot map, and for each feature, we're going to go ahead and return some JSX. Let's make sure we do that correctly. Return some JSX, and in that JSX, we're going to have a div. That div is going to have the span tag that holds the star that we see, and it's also going to have a span tag for the actual text. So that's where my actual feature is going to go. And inside my div, we're going to say key equals feature as well. So as soon as I do that, let me go ahead and save that and see what my content is looking like on my page. So right now it's all just text content. So let's go ahead and start changing that with some of our styles. The first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and add the padding to my section. So I'm going to say class name on my section, and we'll say PY24. That should add the 96 pixels of padding top and bottom that we need for this section. Inside of my tag, we need to center this on the page. So I'm just going to go ahead and wrap a div around my tag and say class name equals flex justify center to flex that towards the center of the page. For my H2, we need a class name here as well. We're going to say that the font size is text 6XL. The font weight is going to be medium, so we can use font medium to get that to work. We're going to move this towards the center with text center. We're going to give this a little bit of top margin with MT6, and that should be all the styles that we need to apply for now. For our span tag, we know that this is going to have a class name of text lime 400, just to give that different text color. Now for our cards, we're going to handle these a little bit differently because each of these cards looks the same. So it has the same kind of title, description, and surrounding styles. So we don't want to reduplicate all of those styles every single time. In fact, what we'd like to do is probably create some sort of feature card component and then just change the image inside and make that interactive where we need to. So I'm going to take the HTML that I've already written for one of my feature cards and go ahead and create a feature card component. So I'm going to come inside of my components directory, create a new file, call this featurecard.tsx, and then use that to go ahead and export a default function of feature card. And of course, that is going to take in some props, which we're not sure what those are yet. And we're going to return some JSX in the form of our feature card div. Now we know that for our feature card that we're going to have some children that live here because that's going to be what we're going to change. But then these other things we can take in as props, like the title and the description. So we're going to go ahead and do that right now. So for our props, I'm going to say that the TypeScript type is going to be title, which is going to be a string and it's going to be required. We're also going to have a description, which is going to be a required string. And after I save that, let me go ahead and destructure my props. So I'm going to say const title and description is equal to props. And then we can just drop those title and description right in there. So I'm going to replace this with title, and I'm going to replace this second one with my description. After I've done that, I also know that I'm going to be accepting children. So I'm going to say children, and that's going to be an optional React node. And then I'm just going to drop those children inside of this div right here. So I can say children here. And of course I need to destructure that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that off of props and drop that directly into that div. Now that we have this props in place, we can go ahead and start to use this feature card so we can see our styles as we add this feature card in. So I'm going to come back to my features, come to the top of my file and import my feature card from @/components/feature card. And then anywhere we have a feature card, I'm going to replace it with my feature card component. So I'm going to say feature card here. We're going to say title equals, and we're going to have just copy and paste what we have already created here. So I'm going to say title equals that. The description is going to be the copied and pasted description as well. And that should allow us to have our feature card. The center there is where those children are going to go. So after we have that, I can just go ahead and remove my first feature card and then do the same thing for my second and third. So I go ahead and add 2 more of those in and then just copy and paste what we had below. So interactive prototyping is going to go into the title for the second one. Engage your clients is going to go inside of the description. And then for my third feature card, we have keyboard quick actions. And for my third description, we have these powerful commands here, just going to copying and pasting that inside my feature card. After I've done that, I can delete my other two divs and just rely on having these feature card components. I'm still seeing my content show up, certainly not styled yet, but we're going to get to that next. Coming back to my feature card styles, let's go ahead and start to style up these cards. We know that we're going to have a class name for our wrapper. We're going to give this a background by saying BG neutral 900. We're also going to give it a border. So we're going to say border and then border white /10. Should give it a white border with a 10% opacity. We also want to give each of these padding. So I'm going to say P6 to give those padding. And we're going to say rounded 3XL to give them the right amount of border radius. For the title itself, we want those to be the right size. So I'm going to say class name here and say text 3XL for our title. We're also going to say font medium to make them the right font weight. And then MT6 is going to ensure that they sit down from our image a little bit. For a description, we're also going to give these some styles. So we're going to add a class name to our description and say text white 50. And also MT2 to give those a little bit of top margin as well. For the wrapper around our children, we're going to want to make sure that it's the right aspect ratio. So we're going to make these all kind of the same size. We're going to say class name equals. We're going to say aspect video. That should ensure that they're the right aspect ratio and essentially going to make them the right size. So after I've done that, let me come back into my features and just see if we can make these line up with where our feature cards are on the page. So for my wrapping div around my feature cards, I'm going to say class name equals, and then give this some top margins. So I'm going to say MT12, and then I can either flex these or I can create a grid. Now I like grid in this case because it's going to make it easier to control the sizing of these cards. So I'm going to say grid, and then for this case, because we only have one column right now, I'm going to say grid calls 1, and that should ensure that we have just the one column. Now we can add the gap in between by just saying gap 8, and that'll ensure that there's a 32 pixel gap in between each of our columns. And after scrolling up and down again, you can see that I think our feature cards are aligned with our design, which is definitely encouraging for sure. Now that we have those relatively aligned, let's go ahead and work on our feature card content. So inside of our first feature card, you can see that we have these 3 different avatars showing up along with this 3-dot avatar. So we need to go ahead and pull in the images for these 3 different people by coming up to the top of our file and saying import our images. So if the first one is going to be avatar 1 from @/assets/images/avatar, and this is going to be Ashwin Santiago. Our second one is going to be importing avatar 2 from @/assets/images/avatar, and this second one is going to be Lula Myers, and the third one is going to be import avatar 3 from @/assets/images/avatar, and the third one is going to be Florence Shaw. After we've done that, we should be able to then use these images inside of our feature card. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a wrapping div, and then I'm going to add these 3 images in here inside their own divs. So I'm going to say div for that one, and then go ahead and say image using next/image. The source is going to be avatar 1. The alt tag is going to be avatar 1 as well. And that should add that first one in there. Let's see if it shows up here in a second. Okay, and it does, which means we can go ahead and do that for the second and third one as well. And the second one is going to be avatar 2. We're going to replace that as well as the alt tag. And then, of course, we can just replace the third one with avatar 3 as well as that alt tag as well. Now, just like our feature card, it might be good to go ahead and create some sort of component for each of these avatars. So let me go ahead into my components and then just go ahead and create an avatar.tsx file. And I'm going to export default function avatar. And that is going to return, of course, some JSX. Let's go ahead and start with the JSX that we have right here. So it's just going to be a simple div, and we're going to go ahead and accept some children. So I'm going to say props is going to be equal to the HTML attributes of an HTML div element. And I need to import HTML attributes. That's what it's upset about. So let me go ahead and write that out again, just so I can hit enter and have it imported from React. After I've done that, we can go ahead and destructure my prop. So I know that I'm going to take out class name. I also know that I'm going to take out children, and I'm going to have my other props as well. Now, we actually don't have to destructure children here because we can automatically add it in, but I think it's a little bit easier to see if we do just leave it in as is. So I'm going to say children here, and I'm going to say the class name is equal to TW merge. So we're going to merge in what we add right here, along with what someone can pass in, the user of this component. And then we're just going to spread the other props onto this component as well. So nothing too crazy, just basically enables us to have the TW merge function working and not repeat those classes over and over again. So now that we have the skeleton for this component, let me go back to my features and import that component up top. So I'm going to go ahead and import avatar from @/component/avatar and surround these with avatar instead of div. So I'm just going to replace this with a little bit of IDE magic with the avatar component. Now we can go ahead and style those up. So they're going to be size 20 to make them 80 by 80. We're also going to say rounded full to make the border radius 100%. We want to say overflow hidden to make sure that we don't have any overflow that's showing. We're going to say border 4 to give them a 4 pixel border. And then by default, we'll say border blue 500. That'll just give them all the same border color unless another one is passed in. Inside the border, we also want to add padding. So I'm going to say P1. That'll add 4 pixels of padding in between our image and the outside of our avatar. And we'll also say BG neutral 900, which won't really come into play too much until we get into overlaying these on top of each other. So after I've done that, let me come back into my avatar and go ahead and add a class name on each of these because we want to make sure these are rounded as well. So I'm going to say rounded full on my first one, see if that correctly does that. Looks like it does, which means I can copy and paste that to my other avatar images. I have this div right here. We're going to go ahead and give this a class name of aspect video, which is the same as what we have as the parent. And then we'll go ahead and say flex to go ahead and flex these next to each other. In order to get these into the center of this div, we're going to say items center to push those down, and then justify center should ensure that they are directly in the center. And then to overlap them, we can just say for the second avatar, we'll say class name equals -ML6 to give this -24 pixels of margin there. And then for the third one, we'll say class name as well of -ML6. And that should ensure that those are all overlapping with each other. We'll also want to change the color of the border. So for the second one, we'll say border indigo 500. And then for the third one, we can say border amber 500, and that should ensure that they all have the right border colors. Now you can see that in our design, we have the first avatar overlapping the second, which is overlapping the third. So we need to kind of create the same effect here. And we can pretty easily do this by going ahead and adding a class name on our first one that says Z40. That should ensure that it has the correct Z index. And then for our second one, we'll just go ahead and say Z30. For our third one, we can go ahead and say Z20, and that'll just ensure that they're overlapping with the right Z index. And after that, really all we need to do is add in a fourth avatar. This one's going to be a little bit different, but we're still going to use our avatar component. I think that's going to make sense here. And then inside of that, we're going to create a div. Now that div is just going to have a class name of size full. We're also going to say BG neutral 700. And let's see what that looks like when we create that. So we can see we need to add a couple more classes. Let's say class name equals -ML6 to go ahead and pull that over. We also want that to have a transparent border. So I'm going to say border transparent for this one. And for our div that's inside, we can just say rounded full, and that should make that a circle. This div is going to have 3 dots inside of it. So I'm going to have 3 span tags. So 1, 2, and 3. And each of these span tags, we can actually just go ahead and easily create them by going ahead and creating a new array. So we're going to say array.from length of 3.map. And then we can map over each of these, grab the index, and then just go ahead and show some JSX for one of our span tags. That way we're not writing the same thing 3 different times. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove all of that. and then add a class name for our dots. So I'm going to say class name here. We'll say size 1.5, rounded full, BG white, and that should create our dots inside of there. Let me go ahead and save that and see. Looks like what we have an error, and I'm guessing that's because we didn't add a key. So we're going to go ahead and add that key right now. Key equals I. That should ensure that we don't have any error on the page for that. Now we're still not seeing these dots show up, and that part of that it might be because we didn't tell these to be anything other than inline. So spans by default are displayed inline, which means they can't have a set size and width. So I'm going to say inline flex and see if that helps our dots show up on the page. So it looks like they're right here up in the top. We don't want that to be the case. So we're going to say that this div right here needs to be inline flexed as well. And we'll say items center justify center, and that should push our dots towards the center of this avatar. And then to spread those out, all we needed to say is gap 1, and that should put 4 pixels of space in between each of those dots. So for this first feature card, now that we have this complete, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image on top and see if everything aligns. And it looks like it does so far, which is great news. Let's go ahead and pull it out back to side by side and get working on the second one. Scrolling down to our second feature card, let's go ahead and create a div inside of here as well and add a class name of aspect video. That'll just enable us to be able to size this appropriately. And then inside of there, we do want a P tag. And as I can see from my design, that P tag will say, we've achieved incredible growth this year. We know that we're going to add a span tag around incredible because we definitely want to be able to style it differently. So for my paragraph, let me go ahead and add the classes to it first, and then we'll get to what we're going to be doing with the span tag. So we're going to say the paragraph styles are text 4XL to make it the right font size. We'll also say font extra bold to make it the right font weight. We'll say text white 20 to make it the correct color. And then we'll move it towards the center by saying text center. And then for our aspect video div, we can go ahead and say flex items center justify center. And hopefully that will move it towards the center of that div. Now to make our incredible text stand out, we do need to add some styles here as well. So we'll say class name equals BG gradient 2R for to right from purple 400 to pink 400, and that should add the background gradient. Of course, we're going to still need to change some things. So we'll say BG clip text to get it to clip to the text, and then we can say text transparent to get the text to show as transparent over our background gradient. Let's go ahead and take our reference image and overlay it and see if everything looks good on this second feature card. So the other thing I'm noticing is that the we've achieved looks a little weird. Looks like that's because I have misspelled achieved. So if I hit save on that, hopefully it aligns into place, and that looks like that's correct, which means that we now have our second card done. So let me go ahead down to our third card and see what we need to do for this card. The third card is going to add in these 3 keys. So we're going to do something very similar. We're going to say div class name equals aspect video. And we keep adding this aspect video because we want to match what we have in our feature card, but we also want to be able to flex things towards the center. So I'm going to say flex items center justify center, and that should push whatever keys we create in the middle of this div towards the center of this particular div. For the first key, I'm going to go ahead and give a div to that. We're going to have the text of shift, and we're going to have 2 more keys as well. The next one's going to be alt, and of course the next one is going to be just the capital letter C. We can definitely add a component to this as well because of course we're going to be copying a lot of the same styles over and over. So I'm going to go ahead and make my component. I'm going to add a component for key.tsx, and then I'm going to export default function key, taking in some props, which is going to be the HTML attributes of an HTML div element. And that's going to return just some JSX in the form of a div. We do know that we're going to have some children. So let me go ahead and destructure this. I'm going to say const class name because we can pull that off. Children is going to be equal to props. And of course, we can go ahead and spread our other props. And in here, I'm going to say class name equals TW merge whatever we're going to add in plus our class name that someone can pass into this component. Let me go ahead and make sure TW merge is imported into this file. We're also going to spread our other props, and inside the center, we're going to put our children. So a very basic component that just basically allows us to have some classes that we can add by default. Let's go ahead and integrate this into our features component. So up in our imports, let's go ahead and import key from @/component/key. And then down in our third feature card, we're going to wrap these instead of with div, we're going to wrap them in the key component. That doesn't change anything yet, so let's go back into our key component and see what classes we can add in order to make these work. So the first thing I'm going to do is add the size of these keys. So I'm going to say size 14, which is 56 by 56. We also want these to have a specific background, so I'm going to say BG neutral 300. These are going to be inline flexed items center justify center to get the text towards the center of these keys. We also want to give them some border radius. We're going to say rounded 2XL, and we want to make sure that the text is the right color and size. So I'm going to say text XL, text neutral 950 to make it the right color, and then font medium to make it the right weight. After we've done all of that, we know that our shift key is going to be a little bit wider than our other keys, but that's fine because we can just basically dynamically change it over in our features section. So I think for now we're done with our key.tsx component. So let's come back over here and say that the class name for the shift key is going to be W28 to make it twice as wide as it is tall. And then we can spread these out just by adding a simple gap 4, and that should ensure that the Shift, Alt, and C keys are spread from each other. Now that we've created the keys inside of our feature card, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image and see how close we got to our design. It looks like we're right on point, so I'm going to pull my reference image back out and then take care of the one last part of this section, which is these kind of secondary features. Now, the first thing about these secondary features is that they are spread from the feature card. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a class name of MT8, and that should ensure that they have the 32 pixels of spacing in between those and the rest of the feature cards. For the features themselves, we need to go ahead and add a class name onto these. So we'll say class name here. We're going to add a background. So we'll say BG neutral 900. We'll also want a border on each of these. We're going to say border and border white 10. We can make each of these not take up the entire line by just saying inline flex. And we know that each of these are also going to have some padding. So we're going to say PX3 and PY 1.5 to ensure that each of these has the right padding. And then we can say rounded 2XL to ensure that these have the right border radius. For the span tag with a star, we're going to use the exact same HTML attribute as we used before. That's going to be and hash 10038. If we don't want to remember that, we could put that in a component, but for right now, I'm just going to leave that as is and go ahead and just have our star showing up. And it looks like I put one too many zeros, so I need to backspace that, and then we can see our star showing up. For our star itself, we're going to say class name equals BG lime 400 and also text neutral 950 to make it the right text color. We're also going to say size 5 to make it 20 by 20 pixels. We'll say rounded full to give it the right border radius, and then we can say inline flex items center justify center to push it towards the center of our container. Now that we have all that done, let's come back to our wrapping div and see if we can get this to line our text and our star up correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a couple more classes. We know that we need some gap in between. So we'll say gap 3 to give that 12 pixels of gap in between. We also want items center to make sure that our text and our star are aligned. The star does look like it's a little bit bigger than the rest of our text. So we'll also need to, at the end of this one, say text XL. And let me go ahead and word wrap this so we can take a better look at what classes we've added so far. So we have text XL at the end of our star. We also have this feature, and the only other class I'm seeing that we might need to add here is class name equals font medium to ensure we have the right font weight. Now, to put some gap in between all of these features, we can rely on our wrapping div, making sure that it's flexed. So we'll say flex, And then flex wrap will ensure that our features can wrap when they get to a new line. And then we can say gap 3, and that should ensure that we have top and bottom, left and right gap in between those. And then justify center should ensure that they can be centered inside of our flexed component. Now that all that's done, let's go ahead and take our reference image and overlay it on top of our coded page and see if anything has shifted. And I'm not seeing anything that's different right now, which is certainly a great sign. So that means that our mobile view is done. So I'm going to pull this back out to side by side, take one more look up and see if everything looks good. And it does look like it looks great all the way up the page, which means we can go ahead and pull in our sidebar, pull out our browser, and take a look at our other responsive views. Now, when we get up to the tablet view, one thing that's definitely changing is instead of having these in one column, now we have a couple of columns. But this is kind of an interesting setup because we can't just say 2 columns because, as you can see, we have this centered inside of our grid. So what we actually need to do is say that we have 4 columns up here and then use that to align our different feature cards. So right here, we would say grid calls 1. We're going to say medium grid calls 4. And then we can just tell our feature cards to take up a specific number of columns. So I'm going to say class name equals call span 2 on my first one. It looks like our feature card doesn't yet take a class name, so I'm going to come back into my feature card and ensure that it can take the class name prop. So I'm going to say class name, which is optional, but it's going to be a string. And then I'm going to destructure class name from props and ensure that we can say TW merge our default classes with the class name that someone can add in. So after I hit save there, that should enable that to work. And then coming back into my features, then I can come down to my second feature card. If I just fold that up and say class name equals call span 2, that should enable my second card to fall into place. And then for my third one, we're going to do something similar, but we're going to say class name equals call span 2, call start 2. And hopefully that should start it at the right spot, which is exactly in the center. So essentially we're taking up 2 columns with this one, 2 columns with the second one, and 2 columns with the third one. We're just starting it kind of 1 column over. So we're kind of starting it at the second column and then telling it to take up 2 columns from there. In order to see if everything still looks good with our design, let's go ahead and overlay our design on top. And I think everything down till we get to the secondary features looks great. So let me go ahead and pull out my design one more time and see how we can address these secondary features. In our secondary features, it does look like the sizing of these changes a little bit. We have some increases in padding, so we need to go ahead and make those changes. So I'm going to say for our PX3, we'll say when it gets to the medium size, we'll say PX5 to give us 20 pixels of padding left and right. And for my PY 1.5, when it gets to the medium size, we'll say PY2 to give that the right padding top and bottom. The font size of these also changes. So we had this kind of base font down here, but at the medium size, we're going to change this to text large. And that should ensure that my secondary features are all the right size. After I do that, let me go ahead and overlay my reference image one more time and see if they look any different. It looks like they're exactly the same, which means that our tablet view is now complete. We can move on to our desktop view. Moving over onto our desktop view, we can see that now instead of having the 2 up and then 1 column, we want to have all 3 right across. So I'm going to come over to my columns and say large grid calls 3 to give us the 3 columns across. And then in our class names, we'll say at the large size, we'll say call span 1. And the same is going to be true for our second feature card where we say call span 1, large call span 1. And then of course for our third feature card, we'll do the same thing. We'll say large call span 1. And the call start shouldn't matter, but just in case it does, we'll say large call start auto, and that should ensure that it starts at the right column. After we've done that, now that I'm going back and forth between my large size and what I have in my template right now, I'm seeing that this title is a little bit too wide. So I'm going to come up into my H2 and I'm just going to give it a max width value. It looks like that max width, the value is going to be max width 2XL in order to ensure that it doesn't grow too wide. And then we also need to say MX auto to ensure that we have the right margin left and right for that title. After I do that, let me go ahead and pull my browser window out just a little bit more, overlay my reference image, and see if everything looks like it is correct. So as I scroll up and down, it looks like everything is perfectly aligned. Since everything's perfectly aligned, that just means we need to go back through our other views and make sure we didn't mess anything up as we were creating some of our responsive views. So the desktop looks good. It looks like the tablet looks good. We can just verify that by going ahead and overlaying our reference image on the tablet as well. That's looking good. So I'm going to pull that back out to side by side. And then on the mobile view, it looks like there might be a little bit of a problem with the way that we've done some of this column work here. So let me go back into my code and ensure that we've added everything appropriately. And we can see that when we made our switch to say call span 2, we didn't say that that happened at the medium size. So I need to add a medium modifier there to say call span 2, and hopefully that will enable this feature card to do its thing. And then for my second feature card, I need to do the same thing. So let me unfold that and say medium call span 2. And then of course we need to fix our third feature card as well. So let's come down to our third feature card. We know that this call span 2 is only going to take place at the medium size. So we add a medium modifier to that. And we also need to add a medium modifier to the call start to rule that we've added. As soon as we make all of those adjustments, it looks like things are back in line. Let's just take one more look and overlay our reference image just to ensure that nothing has been misaligned. And it looks like everything looks great, which means it's time to move on to the next section of the page. Now that we're done with our features section, let's go down to our integration section and see what we're going to do for this section. So we have a tag, title, and description like we do in some other sections. And then we have this little column of integrations that we're going to be showing that's going to be moving either from top to bottom or bottom to top. In the tablet view, as we scroll down to our integration section, you can see that we're adding a second column, and these are both going to move in opposite directions. And then in the desktop view, instead of having the columns on the bottom, we're actually going to have them off to the side, both moving in different directions. When we come back and do our animations, we're also going to make the columns slow down in their movement as we hover over them as well. So that'll be an interesting technique that we'll implement there. But for now, we just have to worry about how we're going to code this up. So let's dive into the code. Coming into our code, let's go to our sections/integrations.tsx and take a look at what is in this file. We have our array of integrations, and then of course we have our default component, our section component that we're returning out of this integrations file. So we need to hook this into our page. We need to go into the source/app/page.tsx file like we've done with our other sections and import integrations from @/sections/integrations. After doing that, we can just go ahead and hook it up to the bottom of our page by tossing our integrations component there right at the end. And if we've done this correctly and everything is refreshed, we should be able to see the word integrations down in the bottom of our coded section. And since that works, I'm going to go ahead and close out my page.tsx, open up my integrations file, and we'll get started coding this up. The first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and put the content in this section. So I'm going to replace our div with a section tag. Inside that, we're going to have a div with a class name of container. And then inside that container, we're going to have our tag that we already have a component for that's going to say integrations. We also need to have our H2 for our title. That's going to say plays well with others. And we are going to have this word others styled a little bit differently. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap a span tag around that. Below that's going to be our description. So I'm going to represent that with a paragraph tag. And that's going to say layers seamlessly connects with your favorite tools, making it easy to plug into any workflow and collaborate across platforms. So I'll save that after we have that paragraph in there. And then we're going to have our integrations themselves. So we know that we're going to have some sort of div here, and that div is going to hold our integrations that we can map over. So it looks like this array is called integrations and it has a name, an icon, and a description. So in our design, we can see that we have the icon, the name, and the description in there. So I'm going to go ahead and create a div for each one of those and then map over them. So I'll say integrations.map, and for our integration. We'll go ahead and return some JSX. That's going to be a div with a key of integration dot name. And then inside the div, we're going to have the icon, which is just going to put a div placeholder there for now because we're going to go back up and change the way that we import those. I'm also going to have some sort of H3 or something like that for the title. So we're going to say integration dot name, and then we'll have a paragraph tag for the integration dot description. After we've done all that, we should see the integration showing up along with our tag, title, and description over on our screen. Now to quickly change those integration icons so that we can use Next/image for those, I'm going to go ahead and directly import those. So I'm going to import my Figma icon from @/assets/images/Figma logo.svg, and then I'm going to do the same thing for all my other ones. So let me go ahead and just go use my Command D on the Mac to select all of my icons. I'm going to use Command Shift over to go ahead and grab what I need and just go ahead and copy that, come up to the top of my file and paste that in. And once again, I can go ahead and select all of my icons and go ahead and start to write some of the code here. So I can import, and I'm going to just go ahead and copy and paste that from @/assets/images/ and then we have our logo path. The only other thing I don't want is my comma at the end. And of course I can just put a semicolon, and that should hopefully make that work. And it looks like I was using the wrong ending character here, which was causing an error. So I just need to change that to a single quote instead of a double quote. And after I save that, I should have all of my icons able to be imported. So then I can just change all of these icons to the ones I have up here. So let's see if we can do that real quick just by changing this icon here to Figma icon. And we'll change this one to Notion icon, Slack icon, and we can probably do this all at once as well, just by going ahead and selecting these and replacing that with the word icon and then removing that single quote. So let me go ahead and save that again. And it looks like that is the case. So we've replaced all of our icons with direct imports, which means we can now drop this into our div here by just directly saying image from Next/image. The source is going to be the integration.icon. And the alt tag is going to be the integration.name. And probably I can just go ahead and make that interpolated string icon. There we go. And then I just need to go ahead and give a closing tag to that. After I've done all that, you can see that our icons are now showing up on the screen. Of course, we're going to modify those so that those are much smaller and are styled up according to our design. But for now, let's go back to the top of our design and start to style the rest of this section. The first thing that we're going to do is add a class name to the section. So I'm going to say class name equals py24. And I'm also going to add overflow hidden here because I know that I'm going to be doing some things where I'm going to have these integrations overflowing a little bit. And I want to make sure that it's not disrupting the design of the site. I think the tag is already styled well. So let's go over to the title and give it a class name of text 6XL for the font size, font medium for the font weight, and then MT6 will push it down by 24 pixels from that integrations tag. Down in the description, let's go ahead and give this a class name as well and say text white 50 to give it a 50% opacity font color, MT4 to push it down by 16 pixels, and then text large to give it the right font size. We also know that we need to go into our span tag and change the color of this. So I'm going to give the span a class name as well and say text lime 400, and that should make it the right color. For our integrations, we need to style the cards themselves, and then we can worry about the wrapping column around them. So I'm going to go ahead up to this div, which is one of my integration cards, and give this a class name of BG neutral 900. That'll give it the right background color. It's also going to have a border, which is going to be white with 10% opacity. And of course, those cards will need a little bit of border radius. So we're going to say rounded 3XL to give those 24 pixels of border radius. And then P6 will give them 24 pixels of padding as well. For our icon, we want to go ahead and give that a class name. And we're going to say that that is size 24. That'll make it 96 by 96. And then to center it in that div, all we're going to need to do is take our external wrapper, give it a class name as well, and just flex it with a justify center rule, and that should allow the content to be justified to the center. For our name, let's give that a class name of text3xl, text to center to make sure that it's centered on the screen, and then mt6 to move it down by 24 pixels from our image. And then for our paragraph, we just need to go with a class name of text center to make sure it's centered. Text white 50 will ensure that it is white with 50% opacity, and then MT2 should move it down by 8 pixels from our title. After we've done that, in order to get the spacing between our integrations, we need to come up to this div, which is actually going to be the one that we're going to use to flex and give the spacing in between our integrations. So we can go ahead and give this a class name of flex call, and to give it the gap in between, we can say gap 4, and to make sure that there's enough spacing on the bottom as well as in between our cards, we can say PB4 as well, just to ensure that that's there. In order to get the gradient effect that you're seeing on the top here, as well as to move down all of our cards, we need to go ahead and wrap this flex div in another div that's going to be controlling kind of the overflow of these cards. So for this div, we're going to give this a class name of H400 pixels. That'll ensure that it is the right height. We're also going to say overflow hidden on this one. And then to smoothly transition these cards on and off the screen, we can go ahead and give this a mask image. So I'm going to say mask image, linear gradient to bottom, and we're going to go from transparent to black at 10% to black at 90%, and finally back to transparent again. That'll just make sure that our cards can fade off of the screen. And then to give this the right amount of spacing, we can just go ahead and add an MT8 rule, and that should push it down by those 32 pixels. Now, if we've done everything correctly so far, we should be able to come to our reference image and go ahead and overlay it and then see it line up exactly. And I think that's exactly what we see right here. We can see the tag, title, description, and our integrations column all look like they're lining up perfectly with our design, which means I think for this particular section, we're done on the mobile view and we need to go to our other responsive views. So coming over to my tablet view, I'm going to go ahead and pull our view out just a little bit, go ahead and put in my sidebar to give our code a little bit more room, and then we'll take a look at what's different in this section. The major thing that stands out as being different in this section is certainly that now we have 2 columns of integrations instead of just one. One of our columns is going to be listing the integrations from start to finish. The other one is actually going to be listing them in reverse from finish to start, and that's going to create the nice effect that we see in this integration section. In order to make that happen, what we probably need to do is take one of these integration columns right here and turn this into a component that we can then reuse for our second column, just asking for the integrations again. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this div right here, open up my sidebar and go to components, and I'm going to call this an integrations column.tsx, and that should allow us to go ahead and export a default function integration columns or column, and that's going to return the JSX that we just saw. Of course, we want our integrations to come in as a prop. That way, when we have them reversed, we can just go ahead and map over them the way that they come in. But in order to create our integrations type, it would be easier for us to go back to our integrations.tsx and do that from over here. So I'm gonna go ahead and put in my sidebar just for a second, and we'll come up top and we'll call this our integrations type. So I'm gonna say export type integrations type is gonna be equal to the type of our integrations variable. After we've done that, you can see that we now have a type that represents this array that we've currently created. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, come back into my integrations column, and go ahead and import that type at the top. So I'm going to say import type integrations type from @/section/integrations. And then for my props, I can basically just say that the key of integrations is going to be equal to an integrations type. And then down in my component, I can go ahead and destructure that from my props. So I can say const integrations is equal to props, and that will destructure those integrations. Of course, I also need to bring in next image, so I'm going to come up to the top of my file as well and import image from next/image. That should take care of that error, and once I save this, this should all be formatted correctly. The only other thing we probably want to do to this particular integrations column is go ahead and make sure we accept a class name as well. So I'm going to say class name here on the props, and that means we need to change the type of our props. And that's going to be as simple as adding a class name that's going to be optional, and it's going to be equal to a string. Once we do that, we can use TW merge here on our root class names to accept a class name from the user of this component, which is of course going to be us, but we want to be able to add that flexibility in the future if we want to hide this column or something like that. So after that, let's go ahead and save that, close that down, because I think that's all we're going to have to do for now, and come back to our integrations file. Now that we've created that component, we can go ahead and use it right here and replace our column here with our new integrations column component. So I'm going to come into here, go ahead and backspace that and say integrations column. And if I hit enter, it should import that at the top of my file from @/components/integrations column. And then we just need to add our integrations themselves. And that's going to be just equal to our integrations variable that we already have. After I save that, if I come back to my mobile view, that shouldn't have changed anything, but I just want to verify that nothing has changed over there. And that is indeed correct. We just need to change this now in the tablet view. So of course, we're going to add another integrations column in this tablet view. So I'm going to say integrations column. Our integrations in this case are going to be not equal to just integrations, but integrations.slice.reverse. Now, the reason we use slice here is because we essentially want to make a copy of our integrations variable because we're going to be reversing it. And reversing it is an in-place operation, which means it would change this one, but it would also change this variable up here. We'd have issues with it referencing the same variable. So to get it referencing a different variable, all we do is just go ahead and hit that slice to copy it, and then we add reverse, and that'll make it reverse the new integrations map that we created. Of course, we know that this is going to be hidden on the mobile view, so we can go ahead and give this a class name of hidden and then medium flex, and that should ensure that it changes over to flex when it gets to the tablet view. And of course, I need to go ahead and add the closing tag to that to make everything happy. Now, the reason the second column isn't showing up yet is because we have not told this outer div to go ahead and show our two columns next to each other. And so in order to do that, let's go ahead and add a couple more classes to our outer div. And that's going to be grid to show it in a grid view, and then grid calls to should ensure that we have our two separate columns. To add the spacing in between, we can say gap 4, and that should hopefully add the 16 pixels of spacing in between. Now we know we're going to go to 2 columns when we get to the medium size, so I'm going to add in medium grid calls to, and that should hopefully not affect our mobile view. And in fact, just to guarantee that that's happening, I go back to my mobile view real quick and just slide down. And yes, indeed, that is the case. In order to make sure that this section is matching the design perfectly, let's go ahead and take the reference image and overlay it on this section and see what our tablet view looks like. And if I scroll up and down, you can see that this is aligning perfectly so far, which I'm really happy with. I'm going to take my reference image and pull it out back to side by side, and let's move on to the desktop view. Now, as you can see from our design versus what we have on our page, the desktop view definitely has some changes that we need to make. We probably need to, at this point, go ahead and create a grid around the text and the columns to move those side by side instead of having them be underneath each other. So let's come back to our code and see how we can do that. What I'm seeing is that we essentially have this, our tag h2 and paragraph as one column, and then we have this div as another column. So let's go ahead and wrap both of those in a div. That's going to be the one that we're going to use as the grid. And then to divide our two columns, we can go ahead and wrap those in divs as well. So I'm going to wrap my text in one column and then my other columns in another column, and then we can just come to our uppermost div and go ahead and add a class name here, and we'll just give that a grid, and then we'll say large grid calls to. That should hopefully move those side by side. We also want to say items center to align our items to the center. We'll say gap 16 to give it 64 pixels of spacing in between, but of course we only want that to happen on the large size. So we'll go ahead and give that a large modifier as well. The other thing we want to do is we want to change the height of this column now that we're in the side-by-side view. So you can see that this on the design is much taller than what we currently have on our coded template. And that's because this height restriction is here. So let's go ahead and increase that by saying large H 800 pixels. We'll just go ahead and double that to our 800 pixels, and that should hopefully make it look much more like what is on our current design. Now that we're pretty much done with this section, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image and see how close we got. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my reference image over to overlaid, and you can see there's a little bit of a problem with our overlaid design versus what we had. So it looks like that's because we have this MT8 here. It's adding some extra margin to the top. Let's see what happens when we say a large MT0 to ensure that that margin is removed at the large size. And it looks like that goes ahead and pushes it exactly to what is in our design, which I'm very happy with. That means we're done with this section. Let's go ahead and take one more look back through our other responsive views by going ahead and overlaying our reference image on those as well. That one certainly looks good at the tablet size. And then I'm going to overlay my mobile just to make sure that this one looks good and everything is still looking great, which means that we're done with this section. It's time to move on to the next one. That's all we had time for in this video, but be sure and subscribe so you're the first to be notified whenever part 2 of this video series releases. In the meantime, here's another great video to watch, and I'll see you in the next video.